This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. This Week in Virology, episode 178, recorded on April 6th, 2012. Hi, everyone. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to TWiV, the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from North Central Florida, Rich Condit.
Howdy, Vincent.
How are you, Rich? Haven't seen you in a couple of weeks.
I'm just fantastic, actually. It doesn't get any better than this. It's really good.
Really?
I'm doing experiments is what I'm doing.
That's good.
And I'm having a blast.
All right.
And it's 80 degrees and just a few scattered clouds. Beautiful time of year.
We're getting into summer mode down there now.
Not quite. You know, what are we in? April?
80 degrees is pretty summer for me.
Oh, no. This is just, this is wonderful. Got a whole house is open, We're cruising around. Summer is when, you turn the AC on, and that we're talking mid-May if we're lucky.
Last time I talked to you, you were about to do the, maybe you had just done the barbershop thing at the baseball game.
Yeah, we did that.
Was that fun?
Oh, that was a gas. That was really fun.
I saw the video, but it was just like a shot from behind you. You couldn't see me.
Yeah, and I wasn't too impressed with the recording. It's always hard to hear what it sounds like, especially off a small camera like that.
Yeah.
We got a lot of good feedback, and it was good fun.
Good. Well, we linked to it, I think, on Twitter.
I saw that.
Also joining us today from Western Massachusetts, Alan Dove.
Good to be here.
How have you been?
Doing well.
Yeah?
Yeah, things are pretty good.
You got blue skies there?
Clear blue skies, 53 Fahrenheit. It's
what's with the Fahrenheit anyway? I thought the de rigueur is Celsius or whatever.
Traditional units. I like them. I'm accustomed to them. But it's 12C.
Here in New York, it is 11C. Sunny, blue skies, no clouds. Just beautiful. Last week when I was recording in Dublin, I did the introductions and I started to go into the science, and someone in the audience said, "It's nice weather here."
Right, I heard that.
They just yelled. Could you hear that on the recording?
Yeah, oh yeah. That came out. Yeah, that was good.
That was great. That's a fan. I really appreciated that. Oh, we have a special guest today. He is actually calling in today from Puerto Rico, where he works. He's a lieutenant in the U.S. Public Health Service and an EIS officer in the dengue branch of CDC. Tyler Sharp, welcome to TWiV.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure for me.
Yeah, you're here because our listener Joel suggested that we get you on.
I did, and I owe Joel, I think, an adult beverage or two for suggesting me. He and I, we worked together in Michelle Hardy's lab in somewhere 2003 on Caliciviruses viruses and rotaviruses up there. So he and I have a friendship and a communication that goes back, I guess, almost 10 years now, which is a little bit frightening for me.
Well, Joel, this is you're doing this show, so we hope you like it, and everybody else as well. I think we had talked about EIS at one point and talked about getting someone on, so he said, you would be the guy, and plus you carry around my textbook all the time, he said, so that would be another reason.
That really did it. That locked it in.
I can't imagine that. You don't do that, do you?
Not so much anymore. I mean, during that summer, I think Michelle Hardy, the PI of the lab, had mentioned that she had copies of Principles of Virology, and I eventually dug into it and read a chapter or two and liked it. And I wouldn't say that I carried it around all summer, but I ended up getting through the whole book in the course of the summer, and I'm sure I was seen once or twice, carrying it home or somewhere else. So
you don't have to deny it. It's okay.
It was with me by my bed every night.
Soon it will be easy to carry it around because it'll be digital and can be on your iPhone or Android or iPad, whatever. So
nobody will even have to know.
That's right.
We can.
So we actually did have another EIS person here on the show, Pat Moore.
Right.
Do you know Pat, Tyler?
I don't believe I do. No.
So he was EIS quite a while ago. I think.
Yeah, it was a while ago. He's quite older. But we had at some point talked about the history of EIS, which came out last year sometime. Investigating the Outbreaks, I think it's called. Have you seen that book?
I've seen it. I will not say that I've read it, but I have seen it on the bookshelf once or twice.
Yeah, we've been meaning to get the author on to talk about it.
Actually, before we go too much further, we probably ought to, for anybody who's been absent, say what EIS is.
Go ahead. Well, maybe Tyler should tell us. Yeah.
All right, so EIS is Epidemic Intelligence Service. It's a 2-year postgraduate fellowship through the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And typically the folks who do EIS are usually a little bit of a majority of physicians, so mostly MDs. There are a very good number of individuals in EIS who are also PhDs like myself. We take a number of other individuals as well, but a postgraduate doctoral level degree is required to get in, so an MD or a PhD. We've got 1 or 2 dentists as well who are in, and I think we've got a couple RNs as well. But the main purpose of EIS is to provide some field experience for individuals either with a background in epidemiology and public health, or individuals like myself without a lot of experience in those fields, but wanting to learn those disciplines for one reason or another. And EIS, I think most of the attention towards EIS comes from disease outbreak investigations, which I think we'll probably talk about a little later on. But EIS does a number of other things in addition to disease outbreak investigation, a large variety of epidemiologic studies and investigations, both longitudinal and prospective, retrospective, you name it. So EIS is it's been around since the 50s. It was started by Alexander Langmuir. And in that year, it was only MDs and it was only males who got in. Over the years, obviously the doors opened to non-males and non-MDs. And over the course of what I guess close to 60 years now, EIS has been one of the driving forces behind CDC. So when there are disease outbreaks, usually, but not always, but usually we're the first ones to go in upon invitation from either state or city, or if it's an international investigation, then a country government. So when things pop up that are of concern or of importance, a lot of times EIS gets called in, and we get to do some really fun stuff in really interesting locations.
How many officers are there at any time?
There's usually around 160, so it's a 2-year fellowship, and there's around 80 people that get in each year, give or take, 5 or 10 each year. So at any given time, there's 160 EIS officers, and we work in a large variety of areas, so both infectious diseases, so anything from HIV to dengue, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit here, to chronic diseases as well. So, arthritis or diabetes or obesity or, childhood abuse or, you name it, any aspect of epidemiology, and EIS is usually involved to one aspect or another.
I think of them
you're
as
played by Kate Winslet.
What's that? Say it again?
I said in the movie you're played by Kate Winslet.
That's right. She was an EIS person, right?
Yeah, the likeness wasn't exactly spot on. But
I was going to say, yeah.
But yeah, so
I think of EIS as CDC's SWAT team. Is that fair?
I don't. Maybe. I don't know if I would go that far. That's definitely the image that we get. And, things like that definitely do happen where, there's an immediate crisis and EIS is sent in on the first lines and we investigate, et cetera, et cetera. It's not always quite that dramatic. The reality is that, sometimes when we go in, there is a lot that's known about the causative agent or the individuals affected or the areas or what have you. But sometimes there are cases where we are right on the front lines. The most famous one of those was when HIVs first started rearing its head in California. EIS was at the tip of the spear in going in and investigating and finding out what was going on. And there are countless other examples in West Nile in New York, and loads of other examples where EIS was right on the beginning aspect of investigation.
Do you have any idea how many applicants to the program there are every year?
Well, I know that in my year, it was somewhere around 450 that applied, maybe around 500, somewhere in that ballpark. And I think for the past couple of years, it's been around that number. So it's usually relatively stiff competition, definitely not impossible. they took me. So, I mean, if anyone has an interest, I mean, I definitely encourage them to apply. But they generally look for people with, a diverse background, whether, you're an MD with public health experience or a vet with, an interest in infectious disease or whatever, or someone like me who has PhD in molecular virology and had a little bit of public health and epidemiology experience. And obviously I was able to improve my skill sets, specifically in epi and public health through EIS.
That's interesting because I had a student years ago. She got her PhD. She applied to EIS, and they told her you need to have some public health experience. So she got that in a year, reapplied, and got in. So what did you do to get that experience?
Well, when I was doing my doctorate at Baylor College of Medicine, I had worked, the University of Texas School of Public Health is literally right across the street from Baylor. And so around about my third or fourth year of my of grad school, I started volunteering with, they've got a group at the School of Public Health there that's called the Student Epidemic Intelligence Society, which is modeled after EIS, but it's a volunteer process, and they work on local outbreak investigations with the city and county health departments. And so through that, I was able to volunteer my time and get, just the tip of the iceberg, which is a metaphor that epidemiologists love to use. So I was able to get a little bit of exposure to epi and public health through that, and that was what really kind of sealed the deal for me in being able to tie together my background in molecular virology and laboratory research with epi and public health.
So you had just wanted to see what epi was all about. This wasn't with the idea of getting into EIS eventually, right?
Well, for me, it was really something to get me out of the lab. I love being in the lab. I still do. But at that time, I'd been in the lab for 3 or 4 years and hadn't seen the light of day and who knows how many moons. And so it was something for me to do something different and think in a different capacity and learn a new skill set and just kind of explore a new field. I didn't at that time know that I wanted to get into public health and epidemiology, but I knew that I was interested in interacting with people a little bit more. And so that was something I was able to do through the student EIS group at UT.
Did you have any ambitions towards this kind of service before you went to graduate school?
Yes, but I didn't know it. What I mean by that is right when I got out of my undergrad, I wrote a little kind of statement to myself about what I wanted to do with my career. I don't know why I wrote it, and I forgot about it promptly after reading it. But after almost when I was done with grad school, I went back and found this document somewhere. And in there, I stated that I wanted to go to grad school and I wanted to work in a lab, but I was worried that I was going to get too isolated in the lab and I wanted to interact with people more. And I had forgotten about that feeling or that idea. But after I'd gotten into EIS, I found that and said, well, hey, looks like I have been wanting to do this for a while. I just didn't remember that I wanted to.
Okay.
So you were an undergrad at Guelph, is that right?
Yeah, so I did my Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology and Genetics at University of Guelph, which is in Ontario, Canada.
Are you a Canadian? Or are you
I'm not Canadian, no. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I decided to go up to Canada for my undergrad because they had a great program in molecular biology and genetics. And at that time, I thought I wanted to be a geneticist, but I ended up running into the same problem with genetics that I did with physics, in that I really liked them at the superficial level. So I like popular science about genetics and physics, but when it came time to actually doing it, I found that not only was I not very good at it, but also didn't really interest me that much. So the nuts and bolts of those two fields was not really what my forte was in, and I think that my inability in those fields, as well as my, not a strong predilection for them, were probably directly dependent. Mm-hmm. So in my third year of my undergrad, I took a virology course taught by a guy named Peter Krell, who was a virologist, and his enthusiasm and love and just very positive attitude towards the field of virology really interested me. And then he ended up giving a lecture one day. I remember the lecture very specifically on the SV40 large T antigen. And I was just blown away by, in contrast to the normal dogma in human cells, that one protein, one function. Here's large T, which is one protein with, 30 functions. And so I was just amazed by the elegance and the intelligence, if you will, of that protein and of that of SV40. And so after that, I was hooked. and I did well in the class, and I enjoyed the lab. And after that, I ended up contacting Michelle to see if she would be willing to take me into her lab in Montana. And she was gracious enough to take me, and I had another very positive experience with her, and her as a mentor, and the group there was one big family, and everybody got along very well.
So you were there in what capacity?
I guess as a summer intern. I think I say that I was a research tech, but I just basically contacted her and said, hey, I'm doing a degree in molecular biology and genetics. I want to get some experience in virology. Would you be willing to take me? And I don't know why she took me, but we talked for 10 or 15 minutes on the phone, and then she said, okay, well, come on out.
And how did you select that lab?
Well, I had contacted, I don't know, a couple different labs, probably more than a couple, in the States to get some research experience. She was one of them, pretty much randomly. My stepsister was living close to Bozeman at that time, and so she had suggested, hey, Montana's got a good program, you should contact them. So I looked on their website and found Michelle, and she seemed really smart, and absolutely was very smart and very inspirational throughout the course of my work with her. But it was pretty much just luck of the draw for me. And
what did you do there?
So we worked, I specifically worked on caliciviruses, on feline calicivirus and noroviruses. And that was when, well, there's still not a lot known about noroviruses, but I'd worked on looking at shutoff of host cell protein synthesis by FCV, by feline calicivirus. And so we did some pulse chase, and with Joel and other people in the group, I ended up learning a lot of just very basic virology techniques, plaque assays and tissue culture and pulse labeling and, the GST pull-down assays and kind of, the very basic things that, we as virologists utilize. So a lot of my formative years, my formation, I guess, came from when I was in Michelle's lab and working with Joel and the other people in those groups.
So in big part, based on that experience, you decided to get a PhD in virology.
Yeah, so I talked to Michelle when I was almost done with my summer internship and said, hey, I really enjoyed it here. I think I want to go to grad school. What do you think? And she said, I think absolutely you should go to grad school. And she very strongly recommended that I check out Baylor College of Medicine, which is where I ended up going. And Michelle had done her postdoc with Mary Estes, whose lab I ended up joining. And at the time, I basically said, Michelle is great. She's really smart. She's really nice. She knows science very well. She knows virology very well. So I want to be just like her. So she was trained by Mary Estes, and I wanted to be trained by Mary Estes. So that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's the way a lot of science works. You get these families and family trees, and a lot of people stay within it.
Absolutely.
So this is good. You're an academic virologist, or at least you trained as an academic virologist, but you could still do epidemiology, and now you're in the EIS. So if people want to take that track, it works, right?
It can work, yeah. So I think in my class within the EIS, there's one other guy who has a PhD only, no MPH, no formal experience in public health. So they do take a couple different laboratorians each year. I think that the competition is probably pretty high. I think my impression is that a number of people who have training in the laboratory want to get out of the laboratory and do something new because they want to travel, or they like epidemiology, or they think they do, or whatever. But as you've mentioned, they do look for people with at least a little bit of experience in epi and public health. So if people are interested in doing EIS, one of the things that I strongly recommend is, in addition to your PhD, if that's what you're pursuing, to also try to get some experience in a public health department, or if you're lucky enough to be close to a student EIS group, similar to what to the benefit that I had during my grad school. And that's something that will really improve your application.
So when you walk in the door, your first day, what happens?
Well, so within EIS, the first 3 weeks is basically training.
This is in Atlanta, right?
In Atlanta, yes. They fly everybody into Atlanta regardless of where you go. I should say that not all EIS officers go to Atlanta. Obviously, I'm down here in Puerto Rico, but I still have what's called a center position, meaning that I work for CDC. About a third or so of each year's EIS class gets sent out to state health departments, and they have the advantage of learning public health really from the bottom up instead of the kind of top-ish down approach that we get. But the folks who end up getting into these programs are of a wide variety and have a large variety of interests in terms of what they want to do.
How does this get decided? Is there input from the officer as well as from other people there?
Yeah, it goes both ways. There's kind of a process very similar to match day for MDs. There's an EIS conference every year that's held in April. And the incoming officers get flown in and they spend a week frantically meeting with everyone that they think they might want to work for. Then at the end, they do formal interviews and people end up saying, okay, I want to work with this group and this group and this group, and I'm going to rank them, 1, 2, and 3 or what have you. And then the groups who have the positions do the same thing. They say, I like this guy, I'm going to rank him 1, and I like this other person 2, I'm going to rank them 2, etc. And they match it up.
So in addition to the state departments, then there are also foreign assignments or overseas or international. So you're in Puerto Rico. Where else could people go?
Well, in terms of overseas positions, this is the only one. So EIS officer, and this is not really an international position because Puerto Rico is unincorporated U.S. territory. Right. It's still within the U.S., but people do not have the opportunity of getting permanent placements overseas. But obviously, a lot of people end up doing overseas investigations for either a short or potentially long period of time. But in terms of where their home base is, it's always somewhere within the U.S. Now, that can be Alaska, or that can be a state health department, or CDC has a couple of satellite facilities in Fort Collins in Colorado and in West Virginia and in a number of places across the U.S.
So how did this selection process work out for you? Did you go in with an idea of what you wanted to do, or discover it while you were there? Did you get what you wanted?
I did. So I put in my application that I wanted to work for dengue branch because I had thought that I wanted to work on dengue. It turns out that I did want to work on dengue. And so when I interviewed, for one reason or another, I was the only one that interviewed for dengue branch. So I just got lucky and they got stuck with me.
Wow, I would have been all over that one.
Yeah.
Well, I think that I know that they did want me, but it was nice for me because there was no competition for it. So I was pretty confident that when I ranked them number 1, that I would end up with them, and it did work out that way. So, I mean, of course, I talked with a lot of other groups. Because I'd worked on noroviruses, I talked a lot with the foodborne group, as well as the individuals who work on enteric viruses, and the flu group, and a lot of the groups there. I mean, you talk with the state health departments, and basically everybody in almost any capacity within CDC you chat with. But I ended up coming back to the dengue branch in my mindset of what I wanted, and worked out very well.
So you, what was I going to say? I'm sorry, not you. This dengue branch, is this something in Atlanta? Is it also in Puerto Rico, or both? Are you at a CDC facility there, or something else?
So CDC dengue branch is a field station of a field station. So our division, which is the level above branch within CDC, our division is in Fort Collins in Colorado. So they're separated from our center, which is the level above division within CDC. So you're learning all of these hierarchical mechanisms that CDC comes up with. So our division is a field station, and we're a field station of a field station. So we're in San Juan. We've been here for, 30 or 40 years, for quite a while, actually. And for a long time, our main goal in Puerto Rico was dengue in Puerto Rico. We didn't do a lot of international work. But when Dwayne Gubler showed up here in, I think it was the early 80s, he started really expanding the work that dengue branch does internationally, as well as in the continental U.S. And then when Hal Margolis, who's our current branch chief, who had been in viral hepatitis for many years at CDC in Atlanta, when he came down here, he really started to push a lot more for us to get international. And with support from our division director, Lyle Peterson, we've really expanded what the dengue branch in Puerto Rico does. Specifically, that we don't only work in Puerto Rico anymore. So we do a lot of things both in the continental U.S. as well as internationally.
So you arrived there in April 2010, right?
I think it was July. Or September of 2010. Yeah.
And so you're almost done with your 2-year stint, right?
Yep, I've got about 2 months left.
Wow.
So what comes next?
Then what?
Yeah.
Don't have a good answer for you. But no, I'm interviewing with a couple different groups at CDC and internationally. I don't have anything nailed down yet. So if there's anyone interested in a molecular virologist with some epidemiology experience, feel free to shoot me an email. But I think that something should be turning up very soon here.
But you'd like to keep doing same kind of deal?
Yeah, I mean, I've really done some really fun and cool and, at least in my opinion, significant projects since I've been down here. So I've been able to have a lot of fun and also tie together, molecular virology with various aspects of epidemiology. So people throw around the term molecular epidemiology a lot nowadays, and usually, at least in my opinion, what that ends up meaning is sequencing. But there's a lot more that you can do with molecular epi than just sequencing a virus or a fungus or bacteria or whatever and figure out where it came from. There are a lot of really interesting questions that you can ask about pathogenesis, about host immune response, about many aspects of infectious disease by coupling molecular research with epidemiology. So at least, again, in my opinion, it's a very powerful discipline in terms of having an impact on public health as well as finding out some cool things scientifically.
So let's get into some of the work you've done there. So according to your blog, there was an epidemic of dengue in 2010, the year you got there. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when I first showed up, literally my first day on the job, I found out that we were in the middle of a relatively large dengue epidemic, which ended up being the largest dengue epidemic in the history of Puerto Rico. Ended up being over 26,000 suspected cases. There were 126 suspected deaths. But when I showed up on the very first day, we had a meeting with the Secretary of Health of Puerto Rico, and we started talking about all the different approaches and ideas and what's going on and how are we going to fight it and what can we do, et cetera. So really, on the first day of when I showed up at Dengue Branch, things just took off. And the next 6 or 7 or 8 months, every day was something new. I mean, you would plot out, when you're taking your shower in the morning of, okay, I'm going to do this today, and I'm going to do that, et cetera. And it never went according to plan because everything that would come up would always be an emergency. So something that you need to attend to. So we interacted with clinicians a lot. We interacted with the public. We interacted, obviously, with Puerto Rico Department of Health, who are our partners in the dengue surveillance system that we use here in Puerto Rico. That's been in operation for over 40 years. So in terms of interacting with partners, there was a lot to do, and there was a lot for me to learn. And again, I was completely new to public health, so I had no clue what I was doing. So I had a number of really good mentors to say, okay, this is the science aspect and this is the political aspect. Because, when you have epidemics like this, there's a lot of political flack that comes out. And so in terms of talking to the media and interacting with politicians and other public health professionals and clinicians, there was a lot for me to learn. And I think that I did a decent job, at least, of picking up as much as I could during that time. But professionally, it was really fortuitous for me to show up on an island in the middle of an absolutely massive dengue outbreak.
So how long did that last, and what sort of specific things did you do?
So the epidemic itself, it started in the very beginning of January, which is extremely early for a dengue outbreak in Puerto Rico. But we started sounding the alarm bells in early February. Our surveillance system is set up so that if we have cases that are reported to us above a certain threshold, we're able to predict that, okay, a month or 2 or 3 from now, the number of cases we're going to see is going to be way larger than it is now. So we need to start instituting and putting into place the public health awareness, as well as any interventions that we may be able to implement to mitigate the outbreak. So this
usually would occur simultaneous with the wet season, right?
Yeah, typically it does, and that's year to year. That is what happens. And 2010 was also the wettest year that Puerto Rico has ever had. So there's definitely a relationship there. Rain is certainly not the only aspect that contributes to dengue epidemics, but it's certainly a big one.
This all has to do with mosquitoes, right?
Yeah, mosquitoes are really at the heart of it. And in Puerto Rico, it's Aedes aegypti. And worldwide, it's mostly Aedes aegypti that contribute to dengue epidemics, but also Aedes albopictus can contribute in various areas, especially like Hawaii. There was an outbreak there a couple years ago caused by Aedes albopictus. But it's really Aedes aegypti, and these are mosquitoes that quite literally have co-evolved with humans, so literally side by side with humans. So without humans, Aedes aegypti would not be living the way that they live now. And so
Now,
they live. Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead and finish the thought.
Well, I was just going to say that these are mosquitoes that live directly in homes of people and directly outside, in the immediate vicinity of homes. So, they're under beds, they're in closets, they're everywhere. So if you go into any random home in Puerto Rico, if it doesn't have air conditioning or very well-screened windows, chances are you're going to find them.
Yeah. Now, Aedes aegypti is obviously capable of carrying other things as well. Are there a lot of problems? I mean, dengue is obviously a huge deal in Puerto Rico. Are there other mosquito-borne infections that are also endemic there?
No, so we've actually been pretty lucky in Puerto Rico. So yellow fever can also be transmitted by Aedes aegypti. We don't have yellow fever in Puerto Rico. We haven't for many years, as far as we know. We don't have malaria in Puerto Rico. We don't have any other flaviviruses to an appreciable extent anyways. We have had detection of West Nile virus in individuals who are donating blood. So we've detected serologic evidence of West Nile, but we have not had any symptomatic West Nile cases. So we think, and we're relatively confident, that the four dengue serotype, or four dengue viruses are the only circulating viruses in Puerto Rico, flaviviruses in Puerto Rico.
And Puerto Rico has all four?
It does. Not necessarily at any given time does it have all four. There's another epidemic in 2007 that did have all four. In the time between 2007 and 2010, dengue 3 dropped off the map, but the 2010 epidemic was about 75% or so dengue 1, and a little bit 20 or 15% was dengue 4, and we had just a little bit of dengue 2. So in that outbreak, we had 3 serotypes. But there can be outbreaks of all four. It just depends on what's going on and herd immunity and all these things that contribute directly to the ability of any specific virus type to take off.
So in an outbreak such as the one in Puerto Rico, do you have any idea of how many are first infections versus second infections with a different serotype?
Yeah, so one of the things that we can do is look for the presence of IgG antibody that that detects dengue virus antigen. And if you look in the right time frame, usually within the first couple days of a symptomatic illness, you can characterize that person as a primary versus a secondary dengue virus infection. Primary infection being the first time that you've ever seen a dengue virus, meaning an absence of detectable IgG in that specimen. Again, early in the course of illness. And if you can detect IgG, then that's very strongly suggestive of previous exposure to a dengue virus. So we know that
secondary infections are likely to be more severe too, right?
Yeah, they are. So that's this concept of antibody-dependent enhancement of illness.
Secondary infections with a different serotype.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
So, for example, if when you're, let's say, 5 years old, you get exposed to dengue 1, and then when you're 10 years old, you get exposed to dengue 2, for example, your likelihood of experiencing severe dengue is significantly, but the actual risk is only a little bit higher, but it is statistically significant of developing severe disease on secondary infection, and less so with third and fourth infection.
So what was the breakdown, do you know, in the Puerto Rico outbreak?
Yeah, it was about 80% of individuals had secondary infections in 2010. And what was interesting is because we had 2 outbreaks that were only 3 years apart, 2007 and 2010, the age groups that we saw of primary dengue virus infection shifted by more than 5 years. So the age groups that were being infected for the first time was only individuals between 1 and 4 years of age by majority. So everybody else within all other age groups were a majority secondary dengue virus infections. That was the first time we'd seen that in Puerto Rico.
So you do this sort of serology on everybody who shows up symptomatic, or everybody you can?
No, we would like to do everybody, but in terms of resources and just having staff to do it, we can't do everybody. So we've got a very good biostatistician that we work with here. So we take an appropriate sample based on of all of the positive cases. We look at them by the serotype they're infected with, as well as their age group, and take a statistically appropriate sample to represent the whole. And of course, we have confidence intervals, et cetera. And so I think we did 787 specimens of about 12,000 that were RT-PCR positive from 2010.
Okay. All right. So you actually get to type them at the nucleic acid level and look at the serological response.
Exactly. So part of our normal diagnostic algorithm at the dengue branch is to test specimens by RT-PCR, which is serotype specific, to figure out the serotype they're infected with, as well as, depending on the day that the specimen was collected, by IgM ELISA. Some specimens are tested by both. And so every specimen that came through the door, so again, over 26,000 specimens, was tested. If there was non-contaminated specimen, sometimes specimens show up and it's a cracked tube or whatever. Those we don't test, but everything else we do test. So we tested over 98% of all of those specimens in 2010, and that was an absolutely massive feat for our laboratory staff. If you consider that in the year or 2 years before that, we usually get anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 specimens. When we had to, it was 8 times that number that came in 2010, it was a huge challenge for our staff. I mean, at one point we were getting over 1,000 specimens per week, which is a huge workload for our staff. But the team came together. We all did things very well. There were hiccups that came during the course of the outbreak, of course, but we were able to get through it. So it was really a momentous achievement for Dengue Branch, for the folks working at Dengue Branch.
So what was your role in that aspect of the outbreak?
So I had a couple different roles. The first was Kay Tomaszek, who is the epidemiology team lead, had worked with the previous EIS officer in putting together a clinical education course. And this clinical education course was based on the 2009 WHO dengue case definitions and recommended clinical practice for dengue patients, for care of dengue patients. And so she had put together this course that we ended up administering to almost every physician on the island in Puerto Rico. It was over 10,000 people that we ended up training. And so I assisted in doing that. I also, at the same time, one of the first things you have to do during EIS is an evaluation of a surveillance system. So as this outbreak was going on, I was evaluating how the system is working, what aspects are taking too long, what aspects need improvement, how can we work with our partners better, et cetera. So those two, both working with the clinical education team and working on surveillance, were my main activities. At the same time, I was lucky enough to be the guy who would go to American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, the annual conference, and say, hey, look, everybody, we've got a massive outbreak in Puerto Rico. It's ongoing. If you have questions, if we can help out in any way, then I got to be the point person. And that was this luck from being the EIS officer. So I got to do a lot of the publicity for it, if you will.
Now, other than the early start for this, was there anything else that you think contributed to the size of this outbreak, or was it just one of those things that you had such a huge outbreak?
Well, I mean, we've got ideas. We really don't know why outbreaks happen or why epidemics happen.
Right.
There are a lot of factors that go in there. I had mentioned herd immunity, and mosquito populations are both critical aspects of determining when an outbreak is going to happen. But there are a lot of other things that we don't know about. So dynamics between the different dengue virus types that are circulating. If there is cross-protective immunity after somebody gets infected, heterotypic immunity, these are all things that contribute, but we don't understand really well how they all go together. We've got a really good modeler, Mike Johansson, who's at the dengue branch, who does a lot of work with modeling outbreaks and trying to determine why outbreaks happen and what determines that, and can you make predictions. And they've made some significant inroads, but I think that there are still a lot of things out there that we don't fully understand yet about why outbreaks happen.
So do you get to do any lab work, or are you mainly involved in data analysis?
I must confess that I have not even touched a pipette since I began EIS. That was made clear both by myself as well as my supervisors that why I was doing EIS was not to continue lab work. The goal of me learning EIS was to learn the epi and the public health. So that's something that they wanted up front that I was absolutely comfortable with in really learning the nuts and bolts of epidemiology. So a lot of my time was spent both in the field and at my computer, analyzing data and looking at patterns and trying to figure out what was going on and trying to get one step ahead of the virus, which you always try to do, but almost never are able to do. So a lot of my work was at the computer. Which is
when
a
I
very
think about epidemiology, I think about statistics. Do you wind up doing a lot of this? Is there strength in statistics in your background?
I have learned more statistics, but again, the biostatistician that I mentioned earlier, so he literally sits next to my desk, and so when I have ideas on stats for things that I want to do that I don't know how to do, he usually ends up trying to teach me those things. In doing that, he ends up doing a lot of the analyses for me as well as for a lot of the folks at Dengue Branch. So statistics has never been my strong point. I'm still improving, but a lot of that work ends up getting done by the big guns.
So a lot of the effort is also vector control. Do you get involved in that at all at some level?
At some level. A lot of it superficially. So vector control, anywhere where you talk about dengue, you always hear about vector control. And unfortunately, the truth with vector control is that we don't have any scientific evidence showing that it works at all. There's never been a dengue outbreak anywhere that we can show has been controlled by any aspect of vector control. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that there are a number of different approaches that people are coming up with now for vector control. One of the most exciting of which, again, in my opinion, is this idea of genetically modified mosquitoes. So there are a couple of different groups that are working on making mosquitoes that, for one reason or another, are ineffective at transmitting dengue virus, either due to the presence of an intracellular parasite or due to being flightless and not being able to mate with their mosquito brethren, or a couple of different approaches. It's still in development. They're still looking at how efficacious and how ecologically suitable these mosquitoes are. But it's really exciting. Again, we don't have solid data on if it's going to work or not yet, but they are in trial in a couple different sites across the world, in Cayman Islands and Brazil and Mexico, amongst other places.
I think we've talked about those a little bit here on TWiV.
Yeah, we have. So tell us about this traditional Puerto Rican control measure.
Well, it's pretty much the same as it is in most places. Are you referring to the actual vector control or tequila on the wall?
The tequila on the wall.
The tequila on the wall.
Yeah. So that was an anecdote. It's a true story. Actually, that meeting that I was mentioning earlier on my first day working with EIS, the dengue branch, one of the older gentlemen from the group got up and said, well, I remember, when I was growing up, a really effective way to keep those darn mosquitoes away was to take a bottle of tequila and rub it on the wall. And you'll never see another mosquito on that wall. And he was really very, vocal about this is what we should be doing. This is the way to do it. And
now, of course, if you drink that bottle of tequila, you will also not see any more mosquitoes on the wall.
Right. But then you might end up with drunk mosquitoes.
Yes.
So that might be risky as well.
Well, there's in terms of vector control, there's something I noticed. I went on vacation in Puerto Rico back in February, and I've been to a couple other Caribbean islands, and it's very common, not only in Puerto Rico, but elsewhere in the Caribbean, to not have any window screens, even on, condos and hotels and such. They're just these louvers on the windows, and you open them up and the breeze blows through. Is anybody making an effort to say, hey, maybe you ought to put up screens?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely tell that to individuals. And I mean, most of the hotels, at least that I have seen, especially the bigger ones, have lots of air conditioning and screens. Right. So I think most of the hotels are pretty safe. In terms of individuals' residences, we can say to them, a good way to keep mosquitoes out is to put up screens or get good air conditioning or whatever. And they do what they want. So if they say, I've lived with these mosquitoes my whole life, I've had dengue, some of them will say, I've had dengue 12 times. And, of course, they haven't had it 12 times. But, people live with dengue. It's nothing really that worrisome down here. So when we say, put on mosquito repellent at dusk and dawn or, use window screens, etc., most of the time they'll take it or leave it. And that's their right as an individual. So they can listen to us or not. And that's one of the interesting aspects of public health. Is we can scientifically figure out something that would be a great way to curb an outbreak or to prevent infections from occurring or what have you. But if people don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. So it's entirely up to them.
The screens have made big differences in malaria transmission in other parts of the world, obviously. So if you can get people to do it, it's a low-tech, effective measure.
Well, and in fact, historically, if you look, there used to be regular outbreaks of mosquito-borne disease throughout much of the United States.
Yeah.
And then with the advent of window screens, you see that plummets, and then it kind of vanishes when you get air conditioning.
Right.
But that doesn't hold necessarily in the tropics.
Yeah. One of the things that people overlook a lot of times is that dengue is not a foreigner to U.S. soil. So whether we're talking about Texas or Florida, those things are a little bit more common knowledge, at least amongst dengueologists. But there was an outbreak in the late 1700s in Philadelphia of dengue.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So dengue has been around for a long time in the States. And there
was
is
also yellow fever in Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
So is dengue in the U.S. mainly imported? Because my understanding is that there's no transmission at the moment, right?
There's still ongoing transmission in the Florida Keys in the southern part of Florida. There's a little bit on the Texas-Mexico border around the Brownsville area.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit as well in Hawaii. They usually get imported cases, which may or may not lead to additional autochthonous cases in that area. But generally speaking, if you see dengue in the U.S., especially outside of those areas, it's imported.
Okay. I remember when Rich and I were down in at Florida Gulf Coast University. Remember, there had been not too long before that a case in Miami. Remember that, Rich?
Yep.
And there was some worry but it never, I think, spread to anyone else. So that was important.
No, there was a question at the time as to whether this was going to whether this was established dengue in Florida or whether this was just going to kind of come and go.
Yeah. So Tyler, you have any sense of whether it could become established in the southern U.S., and if so, when would that happen?
Well, the possibility is definitely there. So the southern U.S. has both Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. The range of Aedes albopictus is much larger than it is for Aedes aegypti. So we know that those mosquito vectors are present as far north as Chicago and New Jersey. So we know that there's potential for it. How likely it is, there's a lot of debate about that. Whether or not it's going to eventually become endemic in the U.S., I think is probably definitely too early to start making predictions about that. But there's definitely a risk for it. So we do worry about travel-associated dengue. So if people are in Venezuela or wherever you may be that has endemic dengue, and if you come down with dengue-like symptoms, at least as long as you have fever, you should not be traveling, at least back to your home, whether it's the U.S. or otherwise, due to risk of importation, as well as personal safety and the potential need for hospitalization.
So I have a friend who was in Puerto Rico a few months ago, and a few days after he returned here to New York, he developed severe joint pains and was told by his physician that he had dengue. So a person like that, what would you tell them? Should you not go back to dengue endemic areas for risk of getting a secondary infection?
I wouldn't say that at all. Like with any infectious disease in most parts of life, knowledge is power. So knowing appropriate mechanisms to avoid mosquito bites, to avoid risk of getting infected with dengue, is really the crux of what we try to educate people on. So yes, there is a small but significant increased risk on secondary infection of developing severe disease. That certainly doesn't mean that you're going to, but if you take appropriate precautions like wearing mosquito repellent and wearing long sleeves, long pants, especially at dusk and dawn, staying in somewhere if you're on vacation that has, we were talking about air conditioning and good screens on the windows, then you should be taking a number of steps that will protect you from, or at least will lower your risk of getting infected with dengue. There's always going to be some risk, but I don't think
are there any good numbers for case fatality rate for either primary or secondary infections?
Depends on what you mean by good. But I mean, if you look at what WHO has put out, very generally speaking, of the individuals who get hospitalized with dengue, who have severe dengue as defined by WHO, it's somewhere around 1 in 200 that will end up succumbing to illness, unfortunately. That number can vary anywhere from 0.5% to 5%. primarily dependent on what kind of care they're getting. So A, are they getting care at all? Or have they just stayed home and said, I've had dengue before, I'll be fine. And they end up, they're on death's door by the time they actually get to the hospital. For those folks, there's not a lot that we can do.
Are those going to be mostly secondary infections?
Mostly.
Okay.
You can have fatal illness on primary infection. It's very rare. It does happen, but it's definitely the minority of cases. So it's mostly secondary or greater infection are the cases that die, unfortunately.
So you can actually, with appropriate care, you can actually save somebody. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
So what does that consist of?
Well, so in 1997, the dengue case definition for dengue hemorrhagic fever involved the word hemorrhage. So there was a lot of attention given to bleeding with dengue. And over the next 10 or 15 years, people began to realize that a good number of people who end up with very severe illness, and some of which who ended up dying, don't have bleeding manifestations, or at least not major bleeding manifestations. So when we began looking at those cases, it was really shock that individuals were dying from specifically. So now the focus has come away from bleeding. Obviously, bleeding is not good. We don't like that. But that's usually not why people are dying from dengue. It's mostly shock. So being able to monitor the fluid status of the individual, looking for plasma leakage and vascular permeability, having very close monitoring in the hospital is really the key, and being able to appropriately administer crystalloids and colloids when individuals need it, and knowing when they need those things. If you're able to do that, then the risk of individuals dying ends up being much, much lower. But the problem, of course, is that these guidelines, the previous guidelines from 97, are still out there, and people mostly adhere to those. So one of the big things in the clinical training course that I was mentioning that they do is really focus on what the differences are between 97 and 2009 WHO recommendations, because it really was a relatively big change in how we see dengue and what the warning signs are for dengue.
So crystalloids and colloids, what are they and what do they do?
So it's really looking at the difference between what you have in your vasculature and what's outside of your vasculature. So meaning in your blood, how much fluid is there and how much protein is there. And if there's when people die from dengue, it's usually through plasma leakage. So the plasma and a large percentage of the fluid volume is leaking into the chest cavity or into the abdomen or somewhere. And being able to both replenish that fluid in the individual's vasculature and also draw some of that fluid back out from the chest cavity is what the function of crystalloids and colloids primarily is. It's not a miracle. It's not a miracle drug, but it can definitely increase chances that individuals have of maintaining appropriate hemodynamic status.
Okay.
So I understand that there was an outbreak of leptospirosis in Puerto Rico at the same time as this epidemic. Did you work on that as well?
Yeah. So to tell that story, let me take a quick step back.
Sure.
In very early 2010, Kay Tomaszek, again the epidemiology team lead, had teamed up with the Forensic Sciences Institute here in Puerto Rico, and they had said, in 2007 during the outbreak, we had a lot of deaths that were suspected to be dengue, but we couldn't prove that it was dengue because we only had serum. And unfortunately, when individuals die from dengue, it's usually around day 4, 5, or 6 of illness. And that's the time when the virus is lowest in the blood and IgM antibody is just beginning to come up. So a lot of those cases end up being indeterminate. And so she went to the individuals at the Forensic Sciences Institute and said, look, if you see cases that a physician thought that this was dengue or thought that it was an acute febrile illness, get some tissue for us. So take it from the liver or from the lung or from the kidney, wherever, send it to us. We'll send it to CDC in Atlanta, and they'll run the gambit on it and figure out what's in there. And through that mechanism, which started in 2010, we found that of the 126 suspected dengue deaths that there were in Puerto Rico in that calendar year, 40 of them were dengue. So we were able to prove by detection of the pathogen that they at least had the bug in them when they died. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, they had a whole bunch of specimens that were dengue negative. So an interesting question then is, well, if this is not dengue, then what is it? And we ended up finding at the end of the day that there were 25 deaths from leptospirosis. And that was way more than we had ever seen before in Puerto Rico, way more than we thought that there was going to be in Puerto Rico. And so we began looking through the remaining specimens that had been submitted to our passive dengue surveillance system, which I mentioned earlier. So the 26,000 cases that were reported to us, we started looking through those in a quasi specific manner. So again, we took a sample and looked at those specimens, and we sent them to the lepto group at CDC in Atlanta, and they started plowing through them and testing them, and found that somewhere around 8 or 10% of those specimens were positive for leptospirosis. And so we did some shoe leather epidemiology and started looking at the onset dates and where they were from, et cetera. And we were able to characterize that there was actually an outbreak of leptospirosis, which we think is endemic in Puerto Rico as well. So we saw there was an outbreak of lepto on top of the dengue outbreak. And that had happened before in Puerto Rico and other parts of the world. So a lot of my attention, just because I was interested in it and the work needed to be done from a public health standpoint. So I ended up working a lot on leptospirosis while I've been at the dengue branch in both figuring out ways to test specimens and putting together epidemiology. And we brought the lepto experts from CDC down to give some clinical education courses. One of the unfortunate things in Puerto Rico is that if you have an acute febrile illness, a physician most of the time will call it dengue, whether it's dengue or not. So a lot of the fatal lepto cases and non-fatal cases were initially diagnosed with dengue, even though they had lepto. And of course, that's not the physician's fault per se. If you're in the middle of an outbreak and you see a case that looks like dengue, you're going to call it dengue. So we're not trying to fault physicians by misdiagnosing. We're trying to get them to ask additional questions to think about alternative diagnoses. So a good differential diagnosis, and not just say, you have dengue, go home. Because with lepto, it's a very treatable disease. Some penicillin will increase your chances of not dying from the illness.
How is lepto transmitted?
Lepto is transmitted through the urine or contact with the urine of animals. It's mostly rats and dogs, but a large portion, if not all, mammals can transmit it. So we know that there are a number of cases from the fatal cases that had direct contact with animals or with water that had been contaminated by animal urine. And so we think the route of exposure was through that. So it's a very different exposure route than for dengue, but still a vector-borne disease.
Is there any evidence that dengue predisposed people to leptospira?
It's a very good question. We're trying to answer that. Numbers for that is pretty difficult. One interesting aspect, though, is that of the 25 fatal cases that I mentioned, we actually ended up finding that 3 of them were co-infected with dengue and leptospirosis. So I guess to plug an article that just went online today, actually, in EID, in Emerging Infectious Diseases, this was the first case that we found, and we thought that it was going to be a complete oddity, that this is such a rare event that we need to write this up as soon as possible and publish it. So we did that. And through the course of looking at the additional cases that we had found, we found 2 more cases that had evidence of co-infection with both pathogens. So maybe it is something that leads to increased risk of disease, but right now we don't have the controls to really ask that or to answer that question appropriately.
Has this happened anywhere else that you know of? This co-infect or these 2 diseases at the same time?
Yes, there are a handful of reports from throughout the world. I think there's 7 or 8 of non-fatal co-infections. So we know that co-infections definitely do happen. The frequency with which they happen, we have no really good idea. I mean, there's no reason to think that an individual who's exposed to animal urine would also be getting exposed to mosquitoes. Right. But in endemic areas, especially when you have simultaneous outbreaks going on, the odds go up.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to chat with you about is this dengue outbreak in the Marshall Islands. How did you end up getting involved in that?
Well, that was another really interesting and really fun outbreak investigation for me. The whole first year and a half that I was doing EIS, I was complaining to my supervisor that I hadn't been able to really go international yet. And one day we got a call from the Secretary of Health of the Marshall Islands, Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is in the Pacific, in the West Pacific, the West Pacific, just above the equator. We got a call from her, and she had said, in the past couple days, we've had about 30 people who have had dengue-like symptoms and have tested positive with a rapid diagnostic test that we got from WHO as a gift. So we're really concerned about this, and we would like, CDC to come in and help us, both prevent additional cases from coming in and manage patients as they need to be managed, et cetera. So she made a formal invitation for CDC as well as WHO and the U.S. Department of Defense to come in and assist with the response. So after myself and two entomologists, mosquito guys as I usually call them, flew out to Marshall Islands, and by the time that we got there, there were several hundred cases, so that it had really exploded almost overnight. And so we began working with the folks at the Ministry of Health on three major aspects of the outbreak investigation. The first and the most important was clinical management. So we wanted to make sure that all of the physicians, there are only two hospitals in Marshall Islands, one in a town called Madro, which is the capital, and the other town is called Ebi. And I should preface this by saying that Marshall Islands, the total land area is only about 70 square miles, but it's spread out over an area the size of Texas. So it's an absolutely, it's a huge land or ocean area that it encompasses, but all of the 27 islands and atolls of the Marshall Islands are very spread out. So getting from point A to point B within Marshall Islands is difficult. So we did clinical education with the physicians in Madro, and then we went to Ebi and did the same thing there. And then we worked a lot with WHO on setting up surveillance, not only in Madro and in Ebi, but also in the more distant islands and atolls of Marshall Islands. And then the third thing was getting vector control in place. And this is where DoD came in, Department of Defense came in. So there were two teams that came from the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy that came in, with all of their tools and the insecticides and larvicides, et cetera, and began, spraying and targeting the areas that were both public, because we couldn't at that point go into private homes without a request by the owner of the home. So we hit the private areas first of all. So the churches and the town halls and the schools and the hospital. We found blood-fed Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in the hospital, which was very worrisome. And so we started doing vector control. Whether or not vector control had any impact on the outbreak, I don't know. We'll probably never know that for sure. But it was something that the local government requested, and if they request it, we do our best to bring it in. So we worked with DoD and WHO in getting that done. And one of the first concerns from day one of when we got on the ground was, and I think I make this point in the blog that you mentioned, but was limiting the number of both severe and fatal cases. Mm-hmm. So through public health messaging, and this is a relatively small community, only 22,000 people live on the atoll of Madro, and that's where the outbreak was centered. About 80% of all the cases came from Madro. And so we were able to get very good messaging out to the residents of Madro that if they experience a dengue-like illness, to seek care early. And they listened. They did a very good job of that. So it ended up being about 6% of the entire population of Madro ended up walking through the door of the hospital. And about 2/3 of those ended up testing positive for dengue by one mechanism or another. So in terms of how dengue outbreaks go, that's a huge attack rate. But I think that's more a testament to the healthcare-seeking behaviors of the population as opposed to this being an exceptional outbreak in terms of how many people it infected. I think that people are just educated and knowledgeable and probably a little bit scared. And so they went to the hospital and sought care, and they were able to get evaluated. About 10% of people who walked through the door ended up getting hospitalized, and there were some severe cases. There were no deaths, though, during the course of the entire outbreak. And that is a huge achievement for everybody that was on the ground. It was something that I was and am still very proud of, that we did our job. So we came in, and there were hiccups, there were problems along the way, of course, but we were able to get through them. And our end goal of saving lives is what we did. So it was a great experience. I learned a lot in many different aspects of public health and epidemiology and dengueology as well. And it feels good to be able to contribute to the health and safety of individuals who need help. So it was a life-changing experience for me. I mean, I don't say that lightly, but it definitely gave me a very different perspective on what I do and why I do it. all of us that do science, we do it because it's interesting and because it's fun. But at the end of the day, why are we doing it? And for me, one of the things that I learned is that I do science to try and improve other people's lives one way or another. And so this was a great example for me of being able to get in there and do that.
Had there been dengue before in the Marshalls, or was this new?
They thought that there had not. CDC had actually investigated an outbreak in 1989 of dengue. There was no record of this that was publicly available. We actually ended up talking to the former branch chief and said, "Hey, we're going to the Marshall Islands. Have you ever been there before?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I was there in 1989. Here's the report that we put together, and I'll fax it over to you." So he sent it out. He copied it from his personal notebook. So dengue was there before. How much of it was there, we don't know. But
if you're doing the same sort of serology that you've done in Puerto Rico, you ought to be able to get an idea from that about that, right?
Yeah, so one of the really cool things that we came out of from this outbreak is when we looked at the epidemiology, we saw that individuals who were between 10 and 25 years old represented more than 70% of all the cases that we were seeing. And when we compared that with individuals who were 9 or less, the attack rate was 10 times higher in individuals who are 10 to 25 years old. And so one of our first questions was, what's going on? Why is that? We thought it was going to be kids who are mostly affected because we see kids playing on, massive tire piles that have mosquitoes all around them. So the kids should be the ones getting most affected. But it wasn't that way. So we began asking why. And when we finally figured out the serotype, which was dengue type 4, it began to make a little bit more sense. Dengue 4 is interesting because on primary infection, somewhere around 90% of people who are experiencing a primary infection with dengue 4 will either have an asymptomatic illness, or an asymptomatic infection, or a very mild illness that typically is not clinically apparent. So that's in contrast to a secondary infection with dengue 4, which are much more frequently clinically apparent. So based on the age distribution, we started thinking that folks who are between 10 and 25 years old, those may be secondary infections, and they may have been previously exposed to a dengue virus serotype. We don't know which one yet, but there may have been an epidemic 10 or so years before this outbreak that went undetected.
Of something other than 4. Something other than 4.
Something other than 4, correct. Correct. So that's the working hypothesis. We're still testing specimens to demonstrate that conclusively, but that's what we think was going on. So we think that if we would go in and bleed everybody in Marshall Islands, in Majuro, and look at the presence of antibodies, that we would probably see lots of antibodies amongst the whole community, 0 to 9 years old, as well as any age group above that. But we think that it was mostly symptomatic infections that were clinically apparent in those 10 and 25s because they were probably secondary infections. But again, we don't know.
So could it be is a reasonable hypothesis for the emergence of this epidemic that a relative or a new serotype was introduced, or a recent? Hadn't been there for a long time.
Dengue 4 we don't think it had been there for a long time. It could have been there at low levels, but we don't know that for sure. One of the other interesting aspects of the outbreak was so when we sequenced the dengue 4, we worked with Jorge Munoz and a doctoral student named Gilberto Santiago here at Dengue Branch. So when we got the virus back here, they sequenced it and did the phylogeny. And dengue 4 had been seen for about 10 years or so before in most of the Pacific Islands, but for one reason or another, not in the Marshall Islands. And so when we compared the dengue 4 from the Marshalls in the 2011-12 outbreak, it was a different virus. It belonged to a different clade. And the viruses that it was most related to came from 2011 from Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So we think that the dengue 4 may have actually been imported from some other region of the world, likely somewhere in Southeast Asia, and that was the cause of the outbreak. So actually we do think that it was a different clade that was responsible for the outbreak. In terms of when the introduction happened, we have no idea. But that's the idea for right now.
And then it presumably spread, you found it on some other atolls in the chain. It presumably just the normal cargo freight that travels back and forth, maybe some tires or something.
Yep, something like that. We don't know the exact, most likely people, but it could be infected mosquitoes, like you said, in old tires or whatever. But it ended up, island hopping. It got over to Ebi. It went up to a good number of the other islands and atolls in RMI. So it made its way around for sure. And we were able to pick up those cases because we had instituted surveillance in those more remote areas by the best means that we were able to.
Sounds like a great experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really.
It really was. I mean, it was a lot of fun for one. I mean, it was stressful, absolutely. But, in terms of learning about public health and what you do and why you do it and how you do it, I mean, it was an absolutely wonderful learning experience for me. And I made a lot of good friends, too. I mean, I still see and talk to a couple of the people from Marshall Islands. They were just at the ICEID conference in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. So I met up with them and, reminisced a little bit. But, I mean, it was a great experience in every aspect. So I was really lucky both to be able to participate and also to be at the dengue branch at all when all of these things happened. So, I mean, again, it was a lot of just good luck professionally on my point.
Well, you also make the point in your blogs about the community spirit amongst the people there that you encountered, and I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was really something remarkable. I really wasn't expecting to be affected from that perspective, but a lot of the clinicians, especially that worked in Ibai and Madro, are phenomenal. I mean, they could cut it absolutely in the U.S. or Europe, anywhere they wanted to work. But they're working in those areas specifically because they're a part of the community and because they want to be there. So, they work extremely long days. There's always things coming through. They've got endemic TB, they've got endemic leprosy, they've got typhoid fever, they've got all kinds of things. So there's no lack of work for them, but their spirit in being there is really just amazing and impressive for me. So it was, in that aspect as well, it was a learning experience. So it was really pretty cool.
I want to ask you just one more thing because we've kept you a long time here. You are a lieutenant. What does that mean?
Oh, I don't know, but no. So I'm a lieutenant in the U.S. Public Health Service, and most people probably don't know what USPHS is, but it's one of the 7 uniformed services in the U.S. government. So in Department of Defense, there are 5. There's the Army and Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and the Marines, and then there are 2 other ones: the U.S. Public Health Service and NOAA. And all of us wear uniforms, so we are a part of the U.S. government. And the U.S. Public Health Service has its objective of promoting, protecting, and advancing the health and safety of the nation. So what that means is that we work for a large number of governmental agencies, of which CDC is one. And basically, we work pretty much normal jobs, but we wear the uniform while we're doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's a cool thing for me to be able to. I mean, I'm not real big into guns and warfare and pretty anti that sort of thing. So it's cool for me to be able to work for the country and work for individuals of my country, which I love, and be able to do that through medicine and science and thought and humanitarianism. So it's a cool organization to work for if people are interested in it. I mean, there's websites out there, of course, but there's a lot of information. So it's a really interesting and fun organization.
But that's a title, so you don't actually do it. You have not had any military training whatsoever, right?
Really none whatsoever. There's a 2-week, it's called Officer Basic course that we need to do right when we join up. It teaches us the basics of how to salute and how to determine people's ranks and why we wear ribbons and the history and that sort of thing, and how to initiate a public health response. So especially in times of disasters when PHS gets activated. So when Katrina happened and when 9/11 happened, PHS was activated. There's only 7,000 people, give or take, in PHS, so we're pretty small. But we do a lot of different things for the country.
So when you leave EIS, are you no longer a lieutenant?
It depends on if I stay PHS or not. I would like to. It depends on the job that I get afterwards. If I stay with CDC, then I'll stay with PHS. But if, for example, I would go to work for WHO or for a non-U.S. governmental organization, then I would leave PHS. But we'll see.
Great. Well, Tyler, that was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
We usually do email now, but we've held you a long time, and you're fully welcome to leave at this point.
I would love to stick around and see if there's anything else. I mean, I'll just listen, but
sure.
I appreciate the opportunity.
No, jump in.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You can say anything. I just wanted to give you the option.
I have one last dengue question. So, is the diagnosis a clinical diagnosis initially, is there any rapid diagnostic test?
There are a couple RDTs that are out there. Some of them are relatively good. Some of them are relatively bad. None of them are approved yet by the FDA. The diagnostics that are FDA approved is that CDC has an IgM-based assay, and we're in the process of getting an RT-PCR-based assay for FDA approval. The IgM is FDA approved. The RT-PCR we think will be approved within the next couple months. But in terms of RDTs, there are several out there. Like I said, some are good, some are not so good. But one of the things that Dengue Branch is working on now is trying to develop an RDT to identify the individuals that are going to be at greater risk for developing severe disease, so that clinicians can keep a closer eye on them.
Right.
And that's something that that Liz Huntsberger at Dengue Branch is working on.
So for now, you're really dependent on a clinical diagnosis in the field, right?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of flaws with that, though. I mean, we talked about lepto, and there are a lot of other, acute febrile illnesses that, in the mild forms, look just like dengue. So if you live somewhere with endemic dengue, chances are you have endemic lepto and maybe endemic typhoid fever, like in Marshall Islands, and other things that can look just like it. So clinicians are really in a very tough spot when it comes to dengue of making a good diagnosis. We're trying to work with them to give them some tools to, to be able to do that a little bit more expeditiously.
Great.
All right, let's do a few email here. The first one is from Josh, who writes, "Hello, TWiV doctors. Two short things. One, you probably already heard the TWiV shout-out you got on NPR's Morning Edition, Friday, March 30th. He sends a link to that. So they mentioned what Ron Fouchier said at the TWiV that we did in Dublin.
Right.
It's an article by Nell Greenfield Boyce, and she says that TWiV is a science show. So that's cool.
That's good to know.
We also got a shout out in SIDRAP, so I'll put links to both of those. Two, since the NSABB caved and it was more like a rout, you can put one in the win column against the forces of darkness. I know you are scientists, but high fives are appropriate. And we will. We haven't mentioned today because this has been Tyler's show, but as everyone may know, the NSABB met again last week and decided that the H5N1 papers of Fouchier and Kawaoka should be published. And when they are, we will do an entire show on them and the NSABB decision. I don't think there's any victory here. I think the whole thing is an unfortunate period in science. But I'm happy that they will be published so that we can talk about it.
Yeah, I don't think there's really cause for celebration about the NSAB decision either way. And I think there's, at this point, a potential for a huge backlash in public perception against the way the scientific community handled this. Which is
I don't like to think of this stuff as competitions with winners and losers and stuff. We're just trying to figure out what the appropriate thing to do is when this sort of situation arises. And so far it's been sloppy, but hopefully we'll have something a little more streamlined when it's all over.
I'm really looking forward to discussing the science. So
it'll be great to see these papers.
Can't wait till they're. I remember at the SGM Dublin, I had said, well, you put some mutations in, and he said, no, you got it all wrong. It's not right. So I said, we should wait till the papers are published.
Yeah.
It's funny. All right, the next one is from Aisha, who writes, Dear TWiValians, that's a new one. Oh. I submitted my thesis last Monday and wanted to share acknowledgments page with you. Please skip to the end for the relevant acknowledgement. Cheers, everyone. You made a big difference to me. So at Thesis Defenses, you at the last slide, you have a list of acknowledgments, and she has a big list here of all the people that have helped her. And then at the very end, thanks are also due to everyone at This Week in Virology, TWiV podcast, for reinfecting me with enthusiasm for science. So that's pretty cool.
Cool.
Thanks a lot for that, Aisha.
I'm all choked up.
and congratulations as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
On defending. That's really good. I'll read one more, then I'll pass it on to you guys. This is from Johan. I love This Week in Virology, and I just wanted to give my appreciation of the latest episode. So long time since the last video episode. Johan is from Sweden. Now and then we do video whenever we can, Johan. I'm glad you like it. All right. Alan, can you take the next one? It's from your Close to your home state, right?
That's right. Sasha writes, "Hello, symbionts and hosts of TWiV. I'm a high school sophomore from Western Maryland, and I'm writing you for the first time in the 3 or 4 years that I've been listening to you. Admittedly, by now, you all seem like old friends whose voices would be sorely missed if I went a day without hearing a fascinating and entertaining conversation about viruses. What inspired me to write might come as a bit of a surprise, but I'll get to that in a moment. On TWiV 142, Viral Oncotherapy, you discussed a paper involving microfluidics. The details are a bit hazy to me, as I often listen to TWiV while preparing for bed, but I remember the concept very clearly. Having always been interested in circuit design, and since my discovery of TWiV virology, it occurred to me very recently that microfluidics and microarrays, and I'm not quite sure which is a subset of the other, are a very nice marriage of my two primary interests. That being said, perhaps in the future you could spend a bit of time on some papers regarding those topics. I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on them. It seems to me to be a very promising emerging field, particularly for use in fast testing and analysis where relatively little sample material is available. I also found a blog website by the name of Microfluidic Future, which I suppose will be my listener pick of the week. Oh, we should have put that.
Okay, we'll put it down there.
All right, we'll put that in as a listener pick of the week. Now on to the less virus-related but still interesting part, which caused me to write in the first place. Back in 2008, a comic was posted on xkcd.com. That's a webcomic. It detailed a method for determining a number of random locations, at least one of which was guaranteed to be within a relatively small number of miles for any given location. This was termed geohashing and was imagined as a means to select a location for, say, a local meetup. There's a relatively active community centered around this concept, and they've demonstrated that it is quite possible for people to use these random locations for meeting places. This could be relatively easily applied to meetings surrounding TWiV. Using this tool, anyone can find the geohash for their latitudinal and longitudinal zone. If some members of your wide and ever-expanding audience become interested in this, we could begin to plan meetups at these locations. After all, networking is what viruses are all about, isn't it? Anyway, thank you for reading my lengthy and geeky letter, and I hope you enjoyed my comments, Alexander. Alias Alexander, help, I'm trapped in a username database. That's good.
I don't understand that. Do you, Alan?
Vaguely. The hashing concept is a random. It's a sort of semi-encryption thing that's used in username databases when you don't want them to be easily hacked.
Oh, I see.
So
that's a good idea. I think that's a good idea for a meetup. You could try it.
Yeah.
If there are enough people.
The geohashing was new to me. That's pretty cool.
That's cool. Microfluidics and microarrays are quite different. Right? They both involve small things, but the microfluidics, small tubes carrying things to reaction vessels, and microarrays, arrays of nucleic acids on small slides.
But they are starting to merge.
Is that right? How so?
Yeah, people are looking at microfluidic chips that would feed into microarray chips as the basis for doing, because these microarray tests, you're putting your sample across the array of maybe all the gene sequences in the human genome or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you can do the sample prep on a microfluidic chip and then pipe that into a microarray that's a subset of things that you want to look at, maybe genes against genes of known viruses. You could have a rapid diagnostic that would say, hey, this is dengue 4 or something like that. But yeah, they are separate technologies. Microfluidics is piping small quantities of fluid around in a lab on a chip, and microarrays are these templated arrays of stuff that are usually done in a full-size lab.
I think this is the third high school student we've heard from.
Yes, I love to hear that. He's been listening for been listening for he said 3 or 4 years. So
it's great.
Started listening in grammar school. Geeky indeed.
Yes,
but that's
great.
good.
That's great.
All right,
good.
Well, sleep well.
Sleep well. Yes. Rich.
Lawrence writes, I just wanted to express my appreciation for your podcast and to tell you that I find your discussions fascinating. I am trained in engineering, but have a wide range of interests in all things scientific, and am now turning my attention towards microbiology. Listening to your discussions of scientific publications and hearing the scientific mindset at work is soothing balm to my psyche in our world awash in banality, scientific illiteracy, and anti-science. I keep a notepad with me as I listen and jot down words with which I am unfamiliar and spend time afterwards researching their definitions, which opens up new horizons and broadens my perspective in areas that I likely would never have encountered were it not for your podcasts. Thank you all very much for your time and effort. Well, you're quite welcome. That's terrific.
I like that, awash in banality.
Right.
I think I read this in Dublin, but it doesn't hurt.
It's familiar, but that's okay. Hear it again.
All right. Next one's from Paul. TWiValians. Wait, did we hear TWiValian?
We did.
No, it was similar.
TWiValians.
It was TWiValians.
TWiValians.
Wow.
I had to go back and look at that. Yeah.
I just thought you might be interested. I donated blood today, and as I was signing in, I had to read a paper that would disqualify me if I ever had been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. The most interesting part of the paper was that it said a virus called XMRV was linked to CFS, and since they didn't have a valid test for XMRV, I couldn't donate if I had been diagnosed with CFS. I'm an IT guy by trade, so I was really surprised when I read their paper, completely understood the link quotes that had been made between XMRV and CFS, and knew that it had already been proven false. All thanks to the TWiV podcast. Your podcast has always been interesting, but I had never been able to directly use anything in it. That's great. I just wanted you to know that TWiV is also enjoyed by those of us that are not in the field. Keep up the great work. In fact, we had another listener letter on the same issue, donating blood, and we talked about that on TWiV 174 and had a nice response from a VP at the Red Cross. So check that out, Paul. Alan.
All right. John writes, Dear Dr. Racaniello. All right. This is just for you, Vincent. I enjoyed TWiV 171, especially your lively discussion on our study of virus production from single cells, Tim and Yin Virology. Your discussion touched on what might happen if cells were infected with single virus particles, or how virus yields might depend on the cell cycle. In previous work, we infected single cells with single virus particles using a GFP virus that allowed us to detect and sort single infected cells before the start of virus release. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
We found that in most cases, high yield or low yield growth phenotypes did not persist from one virus generation to the next, suggesting the variation in growth behavior does not reflect viral genetic variation. Our population level measures of virus yields on synchronized cells suggested some of the growth variation could be linked to the cell cycle. On BHK cells, VSV made on average about 6-fold more virus during G2 to M compared to cells in early S phase. If you're interested, I'd be happy to discuss this further. The ASV meeting will be in Madison this summer. If you attend, I'd be happy to meet you and introduce you to my coworkers. And John Yin is at University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, he was one of the authors on that paper we did.
That's right.
I like it when authors email us. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we had brought up, or someone had mentioned, what's the effect of the cell cycle?
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting question.
Yeah.
Well, we will be at ASV in Madison. Rich and I will be there, and we'll be doing a TWiV, John. So come on up and say hi, because I don't know what you look like. Rich. No, Alan. No, Rich. Sorry. Me?
Rich. I think.
Right, so we're going counterclockwise today.
Right.
Cedric writes, Dear TWiV crew, I read this article in today's Wall Street Journal which discusses the growing number of pediatricians refusing to work with families who will not have their children vaccinated. It seems to me that this is an appropriate response on the part of physicians who do not want their other patients contracting preventable diseases in the waiting room just because one family has chosen not to vaccinate their child. I was reminded of the Australian story where families lose their tax breaks when their children are not vaccinated. Because I cannot see that scheme working in the U.S., it seems that this would be one of the few effective means left to physicians who can no longer persuade their patients of the importance of vaccination. And he gives a link to the article. Thank you for your many hours of work you put into the podcast. As an undergraduate biology student, I really appreciate the head start it gives me in many of my science classes. That's a very interesting article and very well written. Which,
yes.
I mean, he just summarizes here. Physicians are, in increasing numbers, refusing to take patients who won't have their children vaccinated. It's a contentious issue, though, for physicians to refuse patients.
Yeah, I would think, right?
Yeah.
Right, but they can. There are laws against patient abandonment. They can't just say, I'm not going to take these patients because I don't want them. But if there is a solid rationale for it, for example, if this patient is, through their own actions, endangering your other patients, then legally they're on firm ground.
Really?
Yeah.
Although the Socratic oath is kind of being abandoned, right?
The Hippocratic,
Hippocratic.
Not, well...
Socratic, too.
Yeah, the Socratic oath. And what did you mean by that? No,
Very good.
they're still providing care. They're just, they're setting standards for what that care will entail.
Yeah, I wish there were a better solution to try and convince them to be vaccinated in some way, or, it just seems that it's going to make the problem worse to not treat them, because then they'll go out and not ever get vaccinated.
I think a lot of people may wake up. There are obviously, there's a hardcore group of people out there who are true believers and are never going to change their minds. But then I think there's a huge population of people, and I've talked to other parents at my child's school and just interacting with people. There are a lot of misperceptions about vaccines because of all the BS that's been shoveled out there about them. And I think, if people have made decisions based on that, and then their pediatrician says, well, if you're not going to vaccinate your kid, I'm not going to treat your kid, that could really be a wake-up call to them.
Yeah. Right, that would be a wake-up call.
Doctors are hugely influential on patients.
All right, let's do one more. This is from James, who writes, I've been enjoying TWiV, TWIP, and TWIM for some time. I am on faculty at a smaller institution, and these podcasts have become my journal club. I have also begun to share the information, and in some cases the podcasts themselves, with my students, asking them to listen to the podcasts and then discuss what they've learned. This past weekend, a thought occurred to me that as a virologist, you might be able to provide some practical information for me. When I joined the faculty, I inherited glassware and other supplies. Among them were these pipettes. I've attached a couple of photographs of one. They are all 10 ml pipettes with a smooth plastic or Teflon tip. To me, it looks like they were designed to have removable/disposable tips. Since the lab I inherited had been previously used by someone with a virology background, I thought perhaps these were for tissue culture, something that transitioned between glass pipettes and disposable plastic pipettes. Have you or your colleagues ever seen or used pipettes such as these? I don't suppose tips are still made for them, but I'm curious as to their story.
I've never seen these.
I haven't either.
They don't look familiar to me.
So, Tyler, what we're looking at here are photos of glass pipettes, and then at either end there's a Teflon fitting.
I got nothing.
Can we post these somehow and see if there's somebody out there who knows what these are?
Have you seen this pipette?
Yes.
I will post that. I wanted to get through this email to do that, but I figure some old timer is going to know what this is.
Yeah, somebody's going
necessarily.
to know.
Yeah, when you inherit a lab, you often get a lot of interesting stuff. So that's pretty cool.
Somebody's going to really score when I leave.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Pass it on. All right, let's do a couple of science picks of the week. Let's start with Rich Condit.
Let's see here. Right. So my pick of the week is the Deep Sea Challenge. It's been in the news lately. This is a National Geographic enterprise that features, actually prominent in this is James Cameron, the maker of Titanic and Avatar and, appropriately, The Abyss. Yep. And he's really an adventurer, I guess, and has wanted to explore, what is it, the challenge, what's it?
Is this the Marianas Trench or the Challenge?
Yes, the Marianas Trench.
Yeah.
It's the deepest place on Earth, like 7 miles down. And I guess in the 50s or 60s, there was an expedition there that was only marginally successful. But he's taken this on with some engineering innovations that are apparently his own and generated this vertical submarine that's very interestingly engineered, that makes the ascent and descent a lot more efficient and allows him to explore without stirring up the bottom, and it's all quite interesting. And he actually made a run, I guess, about a week ago. That was aborted somewhat prematurely because there was a hydraulic leak, but I guess they plan on doing more. Sounds like it was pretty dead down there, but interesting nevertheless. So this is, I thought, an interesting site that I thought I would share with people.
I heard he was tweeting from his submarine.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's what I heard.
Do they have bacteria and/or viruses at that depth?
They must.
I'm sure.
He has the capacity to sample. I don't know that I think he has the capacity to sample, and I don't know that they actually took any samples this time.
I'll
It'd be
bet.
interesting.
Yeah.
Basically, everywhere you
Yeah.
look, you find archaea or something down there.
Right.
I'm sure.
Yeah, now you wouldn't actually need to send a person to sample,
Nope.
No.
just a bucket.
Personally, Alan, I think he should send a bucket and take the rest of the money and send it to TWiV.
Yes, absolutely.
Good idea.
Alan, what do you have?
Well, I had a different pick, but I'm going to do that one next week. This one, I remember seeing this for a little while ago, and I had it in my picks. This is a 1943 Disney cartoon about mosquito control. It's called The Winged Scourge, and it's just brilliant vintage World War II propaganda type of, educational type of film. It's got the Disney characters doing this mosquito control campaign, using the tools of the time. And remember, DDT was not available, and none of the modern insecticides were, and so they're putting oil on bodies of water, and they're using this industrial green dye that was known to kill mosquitoes at the time. So they very interesting slice of what it was like to do that sort of control effort back then.
Yeah, that's appropriate for this episode, right?
Yeah.
Here you go. Check that out, Tyler.
In some areas of the world, they're still using kerosene. So putting
Yes.
a thin layer of kerosene on water containers, which keeps the mosquitoes away, but then has the obvious detrimental side effect of getting kerosene potentially inside your body, which is generally not a good thing.
Right.
Some amazing things still being put into practice in some parts of the world.
Tyler, did you want to pick anything?
I would love to. Unfortunately, I didn't do my homework. I didn't come prepared. I guess I probably can't put another shameless self-promotion in for my EID article.
Sure you can.
Absolutely. You could pick that.
I will pick that. We'll throw a link in there or something. But it's a cool story if you're interested in it.
That'd be great. It's perfect. Sure.
Cool.
My pick is an article by science writer Ed Yong. It's called "Why Did a U.S. Advisory Board Reverse Its Stance on Publishing Mutant Flu Papers?" And this is an interesting question, which we'll take up again as soon as the papers are published. And there is no answer, as far as we can tell, but it's an interesting discussion of the issues here.
It is a good summary.
Worth having a look at. And Ed Yong is a great writer, so check that out. And we have a couple of listener picks of the week. Sasha's, of course, Microfluidic Future, a website. Adam sent one on Twitter. Can I pick the conversation for your listeners? Stimulating expert commentaries on news that matters. And this is the conversation.edu.au. And we have one from Jim, our friend in Virginia. May I suggest this ENIAC programmers website as a pick of the week, just because it gives a group of overlooked women credit that they have long deserved. The site also has a link to a podcast from the New York Times that gives more background from the website. And that's 3, and I think that is enough picks by our listeners. So thanks for those. Check those out. That'll do it for TWiV 178. You can find TWiV, of course, on iTunes, at the Zune Marketplace, and at our website, twiv.tv, where you can find all of our show notes. If you would like to listen on your smartphone, Android, iPhone device, pick up the Microbe World app at microbeworld.org. And don't forget our Facebook page, facebook.com/thisweekinvirology. Do send us your questions and comments, twiv@twiv.tv. Tyler Sharp is an EIS officer for now at the dengue branch of CDC. Thanks so much for joining us, Tyler.
Thanks very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And a special thanks as well to Joel for recommending my blog a week or two ago.
Best of luck in finding out what you're going to do next.
I'm as anxious as anybody to find out. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Tyler. Keep us posted.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Rich Condit is at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Thank you, Rich.
You're quite welcome. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, really good episode. And Alan Dove is at alandove.com. Thank you, Alan.
Always a pleasure.
And also Alan Dove on Twitter.
Yes.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.